In the heart of a grand imperial palace, where beauty hides secrets and whispers carry poison, one girl is about to change everything. Welcome to the Apothecary Diaries, or Kusuria no Hitorigoto, a breathtaking mystery drama set in ancient times where intelligence is the sharpest weapon and even the most delicate flower may be deadly. In this story, we follow Mao Mao, a sarcastic, brilliant apothecary who's been dragged from the back streets into the world of royalty and power. While she wants nothing more than to lay low and go back home, her razor-sharp mind makes her the palace's most unexpected problem solver. From solving deadly illnesses to uncovering hidden conspiracies, Mao Mao's journey through court life is filled with danger, drama, and a lot of clever deductions. So whether you're here for the slow-burn tension, historical elegance, or just some sharp wit with a dash of poison, you're in for a ride. This is Kusuria no Hitorigoto, and this is your full recap. The story begins when Mao Mao's father asked her to deliver a batch of medicine to the brothel where she used to live. Upon returning home, she decided to take the forest path to avoid the route her father had told her about the kidnapping of young girls for sale. But what happened was unexpected. While Mao Mao was collecting medicinal plants she came across, she was kidnapped after being watched as she entered the brothel to deliver the medicine. Long after the incident, we see her arriving at the imperial palace to begin working as a laundry maid, having been sold by her kidnappers. However, she decided to live a quiet life away from the public eye and refused to interfere in matters that did not concern her. While having lunch with her new friend, Xiaolan, she heard rumors circulating in the palace about a curse haunting the emperor's family, causing all the emperor's children to die within months of birth. However, Mao Mao was unconvinced by these curses given her extensive medical knowledge. However, when Xiaolan told her that the symptoms of this curse were similar to fever, nausea, and cramps, Mao Mao began to suspect that the cause might be poisoning rather than a curse. She decided not to dwell on that, wanting to live a peaceful life. In the palace courtyard, Mao Mao heard a fight and became curious about the cause. She saw two of the emperor's most senior concubines, Lady Rifa and Lady Gyukyu, arguing over the doctor's services to save their children. Noticing Lady Rifa's poor health, Mao Mao wondered why the doctor didn't realize that these were symptoms of poisoning, not a curse. She decided to write on a piece of cloth, tie it to a rose, and place it on Lady Rifa's balcony to offer advice without being noticed. Unfortunately, the rose was thrown away without her writing being read. The next day, everyone woke up to the news that Prince Togo, Lady Rifa's son, had died from poisoning. The events then moved to Lady Gokyo's mansion, where she met with Mr. Jinshi, the palace's top administrator. She showed him the piece of cloth tied to a rose, on which was written, "Bleaching powder used for cosmetics is poison. Do not give it to your son. Ignorance is sinful." Jinshi asked him to find out who had written this phrase. He began to remember that a girl had said she needed something to write on. He agreed to Lady Gokyo's request and asked her to keep the piece of cloth. The next day, Jinshi asked his assistant Gaoshun to summon all the laundry maids. He wrote the phrase, "Girl with freckles, stay here," on a piece of paper and asked everyone to leave. After verifying that Mao Mao's dress was the only one with hand-stitching, Jinshi took it to Lady Gyukyu's mansion. After Mao Mao attempted to deny it, Jinshi told her that the type of cloth on which the message was written was only made for laundry maids. He asked her why she had written that message on the piece of cloth and tied it to the rose. Mao Mao replied that she had grown up in a neighborhood filled with brothels, where women frequently used this preparation, causing the same symptoms and subsequent death. She confessed that she was a pharmacist who was an expert in toxicology. Lady Gyukyu admitted that ignorance was a sin and that she had been using these preparations on her daughter to make her look beautiful. Genshi expressed regret that he hadn't known this earlier, which could have saved many lives, like Prince Togo's. Mao Mao asked permission to leave, but Lady Gyukyu asked to become one of her personal maids so she could begin uncovering the secrets of the imperial palace. The next day, Mao Mao moved to the Jade Palace, where head maid Hunyan began introducing her to the various parts of the palace and her fellow maids. The maids noticed bruises on Mao Mao's hand, and their imaginations began to wonder if she had been mistreated in her previous life. They asked her to rest, especially after learning that she would be the food taster, detecting poisons in the food served to Lady Gyukyu. When she received her first assignment, everyone was nervous about the job, but Mao Mao beamed with joy, seeing it as an opportunity to discover new types of poisons, her favorite hobby, and the main cause of the bruises on her hand. After confirming that there were no poisons in the food, Mao Mao suggested to Lady Hunyan that they replace the earthenware with silverware, making the poison detection process easier without having to taste the food. In the next scene, Jinshi asked Mao Mao to come to the meeting room at Lady Gyukyu's mansion, where he was consulting with her about a poisoning among the soldiers. Mao Mao then asked to learn more about the village and the terrain there. Jinshi explained this to her, and then Mao Mao explained that there were plants in the area that produced toxic emissions when burned, and that the soldiers might have used them to start fires in the wilderness. When Mao Mao confirmed this, Jinshi was relieved that the reason had been explained, and he didn't have to punish the villagers. The next day, when Mao Mao was performing her duties as Lady Gyukyu's food taster in the presence of the Emperor, he asked her to take care of Lady Rifa's health after hearing about her amazing pharmaceutical abilities. Of course, Mao Mao couldn't refuse, so she began working temporarily at Lady Rifa's mansion until her health improved. However, her task was not easy. Lady Rifa's maids ignored her and refused to listen to her requests. They even rejected the food she prepared, believing it was not worthy of their mistress's status. But Mao Mao didn't stop. She continued to improve and diversify the food selections and monitor the cooks. However, the maids continued to reject her and refused to let her approach their mistress to examine her condition. Mao Mao was surprised that the maids didn't know they were serving her dishes she couldn't eat due to her poor health. When Jinshi and his assistant, Gao Shun, watched from a distance to ensure the emperor's orders were being carried out, they were surprised by Mao Mao's treatment. They approached her when the maids refused to approach her and politely asked them to allow her to approach and examine Lady Riva, as ordered by the emperor. Mao Mao began feeding Lady Riva and closely examining her to see how bad her condition was. After cleaning her mouth of food residue, she discovered the presence of bleaching powder, which had been banned from use in the palace and was responsible for the death of her son, Prince Togo. Furious, Mao Mao went to the maids to ask who was responsible for Lady Riva's beautification. One of the maids replied that she had applied the makeup to make her look as beautiful as ever. Mao Mao became furious, beat her, and told her that she was contributing to Lady Riva's death. She then dragged her to locate the makeup container she had used and poured it over her, saying angrily, "Now you'll be more beautiful, won't you?" Mao Mao then told all the maids to clean the floor and ventilate the room. She began treating Lady Riva and preparing various foods to expedite her recovery. Jinshi then came to Mao Mao to check on the progress of Lady Riva's treatment, offering her a sumptuous meal and teasing her as usual. He then asked if she needed any help. Mao Mao took advantage of this to request the construction of an outdoor steam bath to help expel toxins from Lady Riva's body. The project was immediately implemented. Mao Mao prepared it for Lady Riva's use. As the treatment continued for 2 months, signs of recovery began to appear on Lady Riva's part, and she was able to go out and walk on her own without assistance. The next day, Mao Mao asked Lady Riva's permission to leave after her mission was completed, but Lady Riva asked her in a desperate voice, "Can I continue my work as the Emperor's concubine? Will the Emperor visit me again?" Mao Mao reassured her, telling her that she had come to care for her on the Emperor's direct orders. Then she gave her some advice that might help her rekindle the Emperor's attachment to her, given that Lady Riva possessed the necessary capabilities and that Mao Mao was aware of her previous experiences from girls when she was living in brothels. This marked the beginning of her friendship with Lady Riva. Mao Mao returns to Lady Gyukyu's service, looking exhausted. After welcoming her back, everyone asks her to rest and relax, but she doesn't like to sit idle. So, she goes to explore the plants in the nearby garden, then to the clinic to try a type of mushroom she found there with the palace doctor. However, they are surprised to find a guard in a panic looking for a cure for the curse on his hands. Mao Mao, who doesn't believe in curses, asks him to explain what happened. The guard tells them that he was burning palace waste as usual, and then the flames changed colors. Then, a rash appears on his hands. Mao Mao explains, in practical terms, that flames change color when certain substances are added to them, such as those used in fireworks. She explains that what happened to his hand was due to toxic substances to which his body was allergic, and that the rash was merely a side effect. She offers him a homemade ointment and asks him to visit the clinic to ensure his recovery. A look of reassurance appeared on his face, and he thanked her for her help. Then Jinshi, who always used his free time to visit Mao Mao with his assistant Gao Shun, appeared to inquire about the poisonous substance that had harmed the guard. Mao Mao ignored the response, saying that her job here was as a pharmacist, not an investigator, to avoid any suspicion or major issues related to the royal palace, and to live as peacefully as possible. Afterward, she went to Lady Gyukyu's palace to help the maids, and was surprised to find many people laying out gifts. She wondered what was going on, and one of her colleagues answered that the garden party was about to begin. This party took place twice a year, attended by the emperor, senior state officials, and military officers. She also had to wear the clothes they had brought her. The next day, preparations for the party began at the royal palace. After the maids had prepared for Lady Gyukyu and received gifts from her to look elegant at the party, the maids began to gather around Mao Mao to apply her makeup. However, when they wiped her face, everyone was surprised to find that her freckles had disappeared and that her face was beautiful without makeup. So they decided not to apply makeup. Then all 4 of the emperor's concubines headed to the reception area before the ceremony began, and Jinshi visited them all to ensure everyone was ready. When he reached Lady Gyukyu and complimented her beauty and elegance, he turned to Mao Mao, trying to tease her as usual. He was surprised by how beautiful and elegant she looked when she turned to him. He said, "I didn't expect you to be this beautiful after applying makeup." Mao Mao replied that she hadn't worn makeup, to which Jinshi responded with a mocking tone, "So where did the freckles go?" Mao Mao explained that the freckles were the makeup. Jinshi was surprised and confused by the strangeness of the response and asked, "Why did you wear freckles? Why didn't you hide your beauty?" She replied that she had been wearing freckles to look ugly, something she had done since she was a child, due to the large number of kidnappers in the area where she grew up. If someone saw an ugly girl, they wouldn't approach her. She added mockingly that this didn't work either. She had been kidnapped and brought here. Jinshi felt sorry for Mao Mao and apologized, emphasizing that the neighborhood where she lived was under imperial rule and that he hadn't known about the danger surrounding the young girls. He then gave her his hair clip, to everyone's surprise, as this meant that Mao Mao was now under Jinshi's protection, and she was the first person to receive such a gift from him. Even her mistress, Gyukyu, said she was jealous because she was no longer officially her lady-in-waiting. Mao Mao was incredulous, not understanding the meaning of receiving the hair clip from such a prominent figure. The celebration began, and discussion about Jinshi's gift to Mao Mao was postponed. Then the ceremony began, filled with festivities and military parades, attended by senior state officials and officers, along with all the emperor's concubines. In this atmosphere, Mao Mao was preparing to perform her duties as Lady Gyukyu's food taster. However, what caught her attention was that the dishes served to Lady Gyukyu were not as usual, which made her feel suspicious. What caught her even more attention was Lady Rishio's expression of fear, as she seemed reluctant to eat the dish in front of her, despite her taster's assurances that the dishes were safe. Mao Mao initially refused to interfere, believing it was none of her business, until the third course arrived. At this point, Mao Mao captivated everyone with her beauty and the extent to which she enjoyed the strangely presented food. However, instead of continuing to enjoy it, she declared with absolute certainty that the food was poisoned. Silence and anxiety filled the room. In an attempt to confirm her words, one of the ministers ate from the same dish, only to fall to the ground from the severity of its poisoning. Upon arriving, Jinshi, who had been closely monitoring the situation, found Mao Mao on her way to the bathroom to rinse her mouth. He rushed her to the clinic, despite her insistence that she was fine and that her body was trained to resist the poisons. She also asked to finish the dish so she could taste the poison, but Jinshi refused her strange request. After confirming her safety, he asked her to share her opinion on who was behind the poisoning. Mao Mao asked for Mrs. Rishio and her food taster to be brought in. When Mrs. Rishio and her maid arrived, Mao Mao began examining Mrs. Rishio's hands and noticed a rash. This prompted her to ask about any food Mrs. Rishio might not be able to eat. Jinshi asked her why, and Mao Mao replied that some people cannot tolerate certain foods, and these symptoms could be the result of an allergic reaction. Mao Mao approached the food taster, confirming that the dish Ms. Riccio had been substituted, and that she was afraid to eat it because this type of fish could cause serious side effects such as allergies, shortness of breath, or even death. Mao Mao then warned the taster that she should have refused to serve the food to Ms. Riccio after tasting it, and that any negligence could cause serious harm, not just minor side effects, but even death. Finally, as Lady Riccio and the maid were leaving, Jinshi asked her for details of what had happened. Mao Mao refused to answer directly, insisting that she was merely a pharmacist and did not follow up on other matters. She claimed that she had asked Lady Riccio and her personal taster to hand her a book of advice and medications in case of poisoning. However, after Jinshi's insistence, she confirmed that the poisoning had been directed at Lady Riccio, but that it had been by mistake when the food served to her had been switched with the food intended for Lady Gyukyu. Jinshi questioned the purpose of the attempt to poison Lady Riccio and tried to link it to the poisoning that had occurred with the guard when some palace waste containing poison was burned. The next day, Mao Mao was eating with her friend Xiaolan after the internal tea party at Lady Gyukyu's mansion. During their conversation, Xiaolan asked Mao Mao if she had received any hair clips during the party, and Mao Mao casually replied that she had received 4 hair clips. This surprised Xiaolin, who was very happy for her friend with this gift, but Mao Mao showed little interest. Xiaolin then suggested that Mao Mao use one of these brooches to go out with the person who gave it to her, which surprised Mao Mao. She began to consider which brooch she could use and chose the one she had received from Officer Lihaku. She headed to the training area where he was waiting. When he saw Mao Mao, he was surprised by her appearance and the freckles on her face, and was not interested in going out with her. However, Mao Mao told him that she would make it up to him by introducing him to one of the 3 famous princesses at the brothel where she had grown up, free of charge. After some thought, Lihaku accepted this offer. When Mao Mao asked for a 3-day leave of absence from Lady Gyukyu, the palace maids rejoiced, believing she had started a romantic relationship, but the truth was that Mao Mao was using Officer Lihaku as a sponsor so she could visit her father, and no one but Lady Gyukyo and the head maid, Hunian, knew of these details. On the journey with Lihaku, they arrived at the place where Lihaku would be staying and were greeted by the old lady who owned the place. Mao Mao gave her Li Haku's fees that she asked for it from Lady Gyukyu as prepaid salary, and then headed to visit her father after an absence of 10 months. Upon meeting him, she told him everything that had happened to her during her absence, including her work as a pharmacist. She then lay down to sleep like a little child, while her father looked at her and thought that her presence in the imperial palace was a matter of fate. After waking up, Mao Mao visited the brothel where she had grown up to check on her sisters. She then sat for a while with one of the sick women there, looking sad and hopeless. Just as Mao Mao was preparing to bid farewell to her father as her vacation came to an end, Li Haku took her in after he had spent an unforgettable night with one of the princesses there. Mao Mao felt sorry for him because he would lose all his money if he continued this lifestyle. Then she returned to Lady Gyuku's mansion. Everyone welcomed her and curiously asked her fellow maids what had happened with her during her absence. Mao Mao was surprised to find Jinshi behind her, his expression clearly angry. She tried to run away to avoid his questions, but he stopped her and insisted that she come with him to the reception room. Inside the room, Jinshi asked her about Officer Li Haku, who he was and how she knew him. Mao Mao simply replied that she had received a hair clip from him at the garden party, and when she knew that he could be her sponsor for leaving the mansion temporarily, she contacted him to visit her father. Jinshi, showing signs of jealousy, asked her why she hadn't asked him to be her sponsor instead of Li Haku. Mao Mao simply replied that she had nothing she could offer, and it would have been easier to ask Li Haku. Jinshi was surprised by her response and asked her what she had given him. Mao Mao spontaneously replied proudly that she had given him an unforgettable night he would never forget. Jinshi stood in shock while Mao Mao left, believing she had provided all the answers they needed. She was surprised to find everyone at the door, having overheard the discussion taking place in the reception room. Their faces were filled with laughter and concern for Jinshi, who had completely misunderstood Mao Mao's words. Hunian approached her and reprimanded her for her naivety in dealing with Jinshi. They then went to explain the misunderstanding, explaining that Mao Mao had introduced Li Haku to one of the girls at the brothel and that she had been with her father throughout her absence. Then Jinshi appears in his office with his assistant, Gaoshun, in a state of resentment and embarrassment, realizing he misunderstood Mao Mao's meaning. Gaoshun tells him that he has finally obtained important information regarding their search for anyone with scars so they can connect the previous poisonings. Jinshi asks, "Who is this person?" His assistant tells him she is Feng Ming, the chief of the ladies-in-waiting of concubine Adu. Then he orders him to leave. We then move on to Mao Mao, who is dining with her close friend Xiaolan, from whom she usually gathers information and rumors circulating in the palace. Xiaolan begins to talk about the suicide of a maid who worked in concubine Adu's palace, and says that concubine Adu will be replaced by another younger concubine. The next day, Mao Mao is at Lady Gyuku's mansion, performing her usual duty of tasting food. Lady Rishio is being hosted by Lady Gyuku's guest, and when honey is added to the tea, a look of fear appears on Rishio's face. Mao Mao notices and asks Lady Gyuku's not to serve it. After the visit, the maids begin cleaning up, but Mao Mao is sent outside under the pretext of resting her. Waiting for her at the door was Jinshi. Jinshi tells her that the maid who was behind the attempted poisoning of Lady Rishio at the garden party has committed suicide. When he asks her opinion, she shows no interest and tries to evade any answer. Jinshi then slyly asks her to help out at Lady Ado's mansion, where that maid worked, knowing Mao Mao's curiosity, and that she would involuntarily seek out any useful information when she is near a place suspected of being linked to poisonings. The next day, Mao Mao began her day with some new maids at concubine Ado's mansion. They were greeted by the head maid, Feng Ming, who showed them their workplace. During the tour, Mao Mao's attention was drawn to Feng Ming's bandaged hand. Mao Mao began her work as instructed and, with her usual habit of assessing the people around her, was amazed at the organization and dedication of the maids, especially Feng Ming. Later, she learned that the Feng Ming family ran a honey farm. She then continued her day as usual. The next day, Mao Mao went to Jinshi to tell him the details of what had happened to her at the palace, but without adding any significant information to the story. Jinshi tried to joke with her, offering her some honey with his own hands, mocking her for not having gained any information during the 3 days she had spent there. At that moment, Mao Mao suddenly began to connect the sequence of events in her mind. She then asked Gao Shun to accompany her to obtain some information after he apologized for Jinshi's childish behavior, which was stopped by her mistress Gyukyu. The information-gathering journey begins at concubine Rishu's palace. Mao Mao asks her why she refused to eat honey during her visit to concubine Gyukyu. After concubine Rishu expresses her surprise at Mao Mao's observation, she tells her that she suffered from illness when she ate it as an infant, and that she was forbidden to eat it because it was dangerous for her. Mao Mao then asks permission to continue, having obtained the information she sought, while pondering the connection between honey and the poisonings that occurred in the palace. Then she asks Gao Shun to bring some books recording past events in the palace. While she is browsing, she learns that concubine Ado was a concubine of the current emperor when he was a prince. However, after the death of her infant son, the cause was attributed to the palace physician at the time, which angered her and drove her to a strong desire to uncover the truth. The next day, Mao Mao goes to concubine Ado's palace under the pretext of delivering a gift from Lady Guokyu. But Feng Ming refuses, as concubine Ado dislikes mingling with other concubines. Mao Mao opens the gift in front of her. A box of honey and a poisonous flower. It's like a coded invitation from Mao Mao to Feng Ming to talk in private. Mao Mao begins to talk, recounting what happened in the past during concubine Ado's birth and the death of her infant. Feng Ming replies that she had nothing to do with it, but Mao Mao surprises her. The doctor who was dismissed back then was her adoptive father. She continues, explaining that concubine Ado's misfortune was that she gave birth to the crown prince's son on the same day as the empress, which made the empress's medical care a priority. She left Ado waiting, resulting in the loss of her uterus, her inability to bear children again, and the subsequent death of her child. Mao Mao told her that the doctor had forbidden the use of cosmetics, which had caused poisonings, which were believed to be the cause of Ado's son's death. But she later learned that honey was the real culprit, especially after Rishio was almost poisoned as an infant by honey. Because concubine Ado was so close to Rishio, whom she considered like a daughter, Feng Ming decided to protect her mistress from learning the truth. So she attempted to poison Rishio during the garden party, concealing the true cause from concubine Ado. Feng Ming broke down in tears and confessed that she was the cause of her mistress Ado's son's death and that she could not bear to tell her the truth. Mao Mao asked her to confess to the poisoning attempt to protect her mistress's position, assuring her that she would keep the secret of the infant's real death secret. The next day, the farewell ceremony for concubine Ado, who had terminated her service at her own request, began. She handed the crown to Jinshi, in the presence of most of the palace maids. Concubine Rishio then came to bid her farewell as if she were her own mother. Thus, a new position was opened for another concubine in the imperial harem. After Feng Ming's execution and the issuance of warrants confiscating her family's assets, all the maids working in the palace or having any business or kinship ties to the Feng Ming family were also dismissed. Surprisingly, the kidnappers who brought Mao Mao to the palace had business ties with the Feng Ming family, which meant Mao Mao's name was on the list of those to be dismissed from the palace. Jinshi's face clearly showed dissatisfaction with Mao Mao's dismissal, but he was afraid that he would force her to stay, believing she didn't want to continue working there. When Mao Mao learned that everyone who had business ties with the Fengming family would be dismissed and that she had been kidnapped by a group of merchants, she began searching for Jinshi to see if her name was among those to be dismissed. Jinshi showed her the list, and her name was indeed on it. He then asked, "What do you think? Do you want to stay?" He didn't want to force the decision on her, fearing he'd lose her forever or come to hate him. But Mao Mao, known for her inability to express what she wanted or beg to stay in a life she'd begun to like, calmly replied, "I'm just a servant and I'll do what's told." In her mind, she hoped he wouldn't fire her. But Jinshi suspected she didn't want to stay, lacking self-esteem despite all she'd done during her tenure. So, he reassured her, saying he'd make sure to compensate her for her services. Mao Mao then packed her things and quietly left the palace. A week after her departure, we see her preparing to go out with her sisters from the brothel to attend a party at a wealthy man's mansion. The party began after everyone had arrived, and Mao Mao was among the girls serving the guests. Meanwhile, she came across a customer who seemed bored and disinterested. She sat next to him, trying to lighten the mood. But he showed no interest in her. Suddenly, when she heard his voice, she froze. It was Jinshi. "Mr. Jinshi," she called out in surprise. He was also surprised and asked, "What are you doing here?" "I work as a part-time concubine, but I don't accept to go with customers personally." He jokingly replied, "Do you want me to buy you?" She laughed and said, "What's this joke?" She was silent for a moment before saying, Maybe it's not such a bad idea. Working in the palace again wouldn't be such a bad thing." Jinshi was surprised and asked, "Didn't you resign because you hated working in the palace?" Mao Mao calmly replied, "I never said that. I was trying to stay, but you expelled me." At this point, Jinshi realized that Mao Mao truly couldn't express her feelings as he'd been told, and that he was confused, so he didn't intervene in her expulsion decision, fearing she'd think he was forcing her to stay against her will. The next day, he went to her workplace and paid the old woman a large sum of money. He then brought Mao Mao a very rare plant and asked her to become his personal maid in his private office, not in the imperial palace. And so, Mao Mao's new journey began.